how exactly does God come into the explanation of morality? What's his role? That's the question we're going to be asking tonight, and I'm very grateful to be joined by Dr. Ann Jeffrey, a professor of philosophy at Baylor University. Hey there, Dr. Jeffrey.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited. This is an interview I've been looking forward to for quite a while. I love the topic of God's relationship to morality, and you have a book. You can say something about that if you want.
Sure, yeah. So I've been interested in this topic too for a really long time. I sort of got into philosophy via Christian apologetics in a way, in that I didn't know what philosophy was, but I read Mere Christianity as a kid and remember thinking a lot about these sorts of questions. And, there's a little passage in there, kind of proto-moral argument for God's existence. And so when I started doing moral philosophy, I sort of returned to those questions. So I was happy to be able to write the book and to think carefully and slowly for a long time about this.
It's a short book, which I like, but a really, really deep book. So it's the perfect combination. And it was published by Cambridge University Press, I think in 2018.
Yeah, 2019.
2019. So it's even more recent than I thought. So definitely check that out. That was actually in my giveaway. I did a book giveaway last week, and that was one of the books I gave away to a viewer. All right. The plan is to summarize that book with 2 interviews. This is going to be part 1, and the book is split into 3 parts. And we're going to try in this interview to cover part 1 and part 2. So part 1 is over God's relationship to normativity. And then part 2 is God's relationship to moral epistemology. So let's begin just with a very broad question. What was the goal of your book?
Yeah, the book actually had 2 aims, and one was a little bit more pragmatic. And that was that readers who had familiarity with philosophy, maybe with moral philosophy, or maybe with some philosophy of religion, but didn't know a lot about what philosophers have said with respect to the relationship between God and morality, could dive right in and get an overview that was sort of organized for them of what the arguments are out there relating God to morality. So that was the pragmatic goal of the book. So someone like yourself could dive in, get a short overview, and then go look up the references and start to read for themselves, figuring out from the book what they're most interested in. But the kind of argumentative goal of the book was to create a cumulative case for the following point. In philosophy of religion and moral philosophy, when we've talked about the relationship between God and morality, we often talk as though there's just one shared concept, God, or one belief system, theism. And then we want to talk about how that relates to moral obligation or value. And I think that this is useful in some respects, because it's nice to know what theists have in common. But in another respect, not that useful, because actually little things that look like little differences in what we believe about God's relationship to creation, whether God's in time or outside of time, those little differences can make a big difference to arguments about God's relationship to moral obligations or values. So the goal of the book is to really encourage philosophers to dig deep into the beliefs of real lived religions and what religious believers actually think about God in the specific details, and to figure out what difference does that belief about God make to this argument that's been trotted out as an argument for theism from some moral phenomenon.
Yeah, and that was really clear in the book, and you were clear there as well. In fact, I don't know if you saw the YouTube title for this, but I said mere theism isn't enough. And that becomes very clear throughout the book, is this just kind of omni-God, just there are these details that you need to specify that make big differences in the argument. So hopefully that will come out tonight. Okay, what do theists mean when they say that God plays an important role in metaphysically grounding morality?
Great question. So for viewers that aren't familiar with the technical philosophical term metaphysics, really here what we're talking about is like what exists and what's most fundamental that's out there, what explains all the other stuff that exists. And oftentimes folks think that God is necessary to explain some moral phenomenon. There are 3 types of moral phenomenon that I use as sort of categories in the book: moral obligations, moral value, and moral goodness. And so arguments about the metaphysical relationship of God to those phenomenon might go like this. They might say, hey, there's some moral phenomenon out there that we can't explain without God. So those are pumping for a pretty strong thesis about God's relationship to morality. There's some necessary relationship. The phenomenon can't be explained without referring to God. And often this is a sort of apologetic tool. And then there are other arguments that go in for a little bit of a weaker thesis, just something like, God probably explains this thing, or why the moral phenomenon looks this way. And that's great for theism, but it's not a knockdown argument that you've got to believe in theism if you think the phenomenon is really happening.
Okay, so those are the 2 varieties. One is, I think, I've seen William Lane Craig defend that kind of necessity claim where God is not just the best explanation, but must be, he's the only game in town if we're going to have this kind of normativity.
Yep, and Craig's arguments are really powerful and widely read, and a lot of other philosophers have followed suit in making that sort of strong version of the claim.
But someone like David Baggett, who I've interviewed, he defends that weaker claim where God's the best explanation, or is the most probable explanation.
So probably, yeah, that's right.
Okay, now, what are the 2 forms of arguments that philosophers offer to support different versions of the metaphysical thesis?
Yeah. So I split these into what I call data-driven arguments and explainer-driven arguments. So the data-driven arguments start with a claim about some moral phenomenon that seems to exist, but that cries out for explanation. So, we look around and we're like, it seems like killing innocent people is really wrong. There's an obligation to not do that. Why is there an obligation to not do that? People think reasonably. And the second claim in these types of arguments is that God grounds that phenomenon, and that's the best or the only explanation of, say, moral obligations, the wrongness of killing, and so on. And so God metaphysically grounds this phenomenon. So what's the relationship of God to morality? Like, God explains it metaphysically. Why do these things, moral obligations, exist? They exist because God exists. And then different theories will offer different stories about how exactly God grounds that thing, moral obligations. Maybe God communicates God's will to people, and that's how moral obligations become incumbent upon us, or something like that. So that's the data-driven version of an argument, moral argument. But then there's this other type of argument that's a little newer. Philip Quinn and Mark Murphy have given these sorts of arguments, but they're not as popular in the philosophical literature. And these are explainer-driven in the following sense. You start by saying, like, hey, here's some moral phenomenon that we see out there in the world. Let's say that we see there's an obligation against killing innocent people, an obligation to not kill innocent people. And then we think about God for a little bit, and we think, you know what? God is the sort of being that if God exists, God would have to explain that thing. God would have to explain the wrongness of killing innocents. It's just part of God's essence or nature. So once we then say God exists, we can say that what's the relationship of God to this moral phenomenon, like obligations? God grounds that obligation. And we know that not because God's like the only candidate for explaining it. We know it instead because we know something about God, that God's the sort of thing that has got to explain, for instance, on one version of this view, God's got to explain everything else that exists that isn't God. This is a feature that sometimes gets talked about as divine aseity. So some people think because God is a certain sort of creator, God's a primary sort of being, everything else that exists has got to be explained by God's existence and God's creating that thing. And that's true for moral stuff, just like for all the other stuff, cats and dogs and the like. So those are the explainer-driven arguments. And those are a little different in that they are compatible with other explanations being really good explanations, like secular explanations for the moral phenomenon being really good explanations. The key difference is like, hey, once you believe that God exists and you believe God is like this, he's a kind of fundamental explainer of everything that exists, then you're committed to God explaining the moral phenomena too.
That was a new one when I read the book. So I learned something there. So I really appreciated that. Do you want to say something here about maybe generally speaking, the advantage and disadvantage of each type of argument?
Yeah, I think they're both really interesting and valuable, probably for different audiences and purposes. I would say that something nice about the explainer-driven arguments is that they start with these sort of theological claims that lots of people within lived religions already are committed to and say like, hey, you're already committed to God being this type of creator. So certain views about morality are sort of off limits to you. You can't just think that we make up morality because actually God has to ground everything that exists on your view. Something like that. So that's an interesting feature of the explainer-driven arguments. The data-driven arguments, I think, are really strong supporters of the metaphysical thesis we've been talking about because they kind of give theism of certain types, theisms that can pull this argument off, an advantage over views that deny theism of those types and say, hey, we can actually do something with our variety of theism that people who deny it cannot do. And that's explain this really weird thing. Why do we have these inescapable moral obligations, for instance? And I think that's where arguments like Craig really get a foothold in broad audiences. It's like, oh, we're not crazy for believing in theism because, like, look, everyone believes in moral obligations that are inescapable, but it's actually super hard to explain those. And we can explain it if we just posit a God that looks like this.
So just to kind of summarize up to this point, there were two metaphysical theses. One was that God has this necessary connection to morality. The other was God is probably the best explanation or something like that. And then when it comes to making an argument for those metaphysical whichever metaphysical thesis you pick, there's kind of two arguments that you can offer. There's a data-driven and then there's an explainer-driven argument. So what I want to do now is focus in on those data-driven arguments. And you actually offer like 3 different forms in your book, but we won't have time to cover all that. So I'm just going to pick one. We'll pick the argument for moral obligation. So how does the argument from moral obligation go?
Great. So this one just kind of plugging into the data-driven argument that Jordan just showed us. Thanks so much for that slide, Jordan. Plugging in the moral phenomenon of moral obligation, we can get an argument up and running that looks like this. there are moral obligations, and their existence stands in need of explanation. A lot of people think moral obligations are super weird. They seem to be universal, apply to everybody. They seem to be inescapable in a way that your legal obligations are not, right? You can go to a different country and suddenly you're not under the same legal obligations. They're dependent on the presence of a certain kind of legal authority. Moral obligations seem strange, different. So people have tried to give explanations. Philosophers, one of our jobs is to give an explanation of where these things come from, if they really exist. And according to a standard argument for moral obligation for God's existence, it's God's will or some act of God's will that grounds obligations. And that's the best or the only available explanation for moral obligations. Other explanations will fall short, perhaps in not explaining the inescapability of moral obligations or their universality, some other feature that we think is kind of baked into the very concept of a moral obligation. And these arguments say you've got to use God's will or an act of divine will to explain these obligations. And so God's will or some act of divine will is what grounds moral obligations.
Very good. Now, obviously, there are going to be objections to this argument. And that first premise just posited the existence of moral obligations. It didn't say anything about God. It just posits their existence. And for the viewers that are watching, if you're like, how could that premise be supported? Morality is subjective or something like that. I did an interview, actually a couple of interviews, defending what would be that first premise, that moral obligations, and not just obligations, values and other things, but there's features of moralities that exist in reality. They're objective. They're not just your opinion. And I did that interview with Terence Cuneo. That was one of them. And I did another one where actually 4 arguments are offered in favor of objective morality. So check that out if you're interested. We're going to focus on that second premise where God begins entering the picture.
Awesome.
Obviously, there's going to be objections to this premise. And one of them is what's called the cudworthy objection. So what is the cudworthy objection and how do proponents of the argument respond?
So I'm borrowing the kind of cheeky term. This is Ralph Cudworth's argument, but I'm borrowing the term cudworthy from Mark Schroeder. I just thought it was cute. So Cudworth gives this argument. It's going to sound a little convoluted, but I'll try to help you along the way. So he makes this argument and he says, for anything that exists, it's either the sort of thing that it is by nature, or it's not such and such by nature. So take water. Water's either wet by nature or not wet by nature. Or my cat. My cat's either orange by nature or not orange by nature. And Cudworth says, okay, so suppose that you've got something that's, water is wet by nature. No act of will, anybody's will, is going to change that. Okay, so if God wants to turn some fact into an obligation, God's not going to be able to, by will, turn something into an obligation that's by nature not an obligation. Okay. All right, so let's think about the facts which are maybe not by nature obligatory or prohibited. Those seem like the sorts of things that maybe an agent could change their feature by an act of will. So you might think I can dye my hair pink by an act of will, and it's not pink by nature. So acts of will might be able to change those things that are sort of indifferent to begin with by nature. So how do we do this in the moral case? Well, in the moral case, what's strange about obligations is it seems like for a person's will to be enough to change something that's sort of neutral into something obligatory, something you have to do, that person needs to have a special sort of standing. So it would be great if I could just walk outside my neighborhood and I could decide everyone should cut their grass. And like, I will that everyone cut their grass. And now it's obligatory.
Yeah.
Cutting grass is indifferent. It's fine that some people don't cut their grass. It's fine that some people cut their grass. Neither obligatory nor non-obligatory by nature. But my will is not the sort of thing that could turn it into something obligatory for my neighbors. Why is that? It's because, according to Cudworth, I don't have a sort of standing or authority to do that. So someone can make something obligatory only if they have a special kind of standing or authority. So maybe God has the sort of standing or authority to make stuff that's otherwise kind of neutral obligatory. The problem with this is that it doesn't look like anyone could gain authority by their own will. Okay, so think about the legal case. We might say like, oh, well, when a lawmaker in the US gets standing or authority to tell me what to do, local officials can tell me that I need to wear a mask when I go outside. How do they get that? Well, I elect them, right? So the will of other people somehow makes it the case that they have the standing. But if God is the person that has that authority, how does God get the authority? Surely God's own act of will can't endow God with authority, or so Cudworth says. So there seems like there's a tricky puzzle here for God. How could God make even the stuff that's indifferent obligatory just by God's will? Now, some views which are called divine command theory, but are really more like hybrid views, they can explain why God has authority or standing in virtue of some other feature God has. So it's not like God says to God's self, I will that I have authority, and then God has authority, and then God can go out and make it the case that everyone ought to cut their grass. It's not like that. Instead, it's like God is perfectly rational or something. And in virtue of having that feature, God has standing or authority to tell us what to do in such a way that makes it obligatory. But then you're no longer like a pure divine will grounding obligation sort of theory, right? Because it's not just God's will, it's God's will plus God's perfect rationality, or whatever that feature is you're going to go in for.
Okay. So we could keep going. We could extend the dialectic here back and forth, but we've got to keep moving. So there's another objection to this second premise of the argument. So we identified the cudworthy objection. This objection is called the arbitrariness objection. So what is this objection, and how do proponents of the argument respond?
Yeah, good. And this one is probably more widespread. When I teach these sorts of views in an intro philosophy class, the arbitrariness objection comes up first, usually. So I think it has a sort of intuitive pull. And the idea is something like this. God's will makes things obligatory. So whatever God willed, independent of the content, it could be obligatory. So a student will say, so you're telling me that if God had created a world where God said, you have to sacrifice every third-born child, then that would be obligatory? Or God creates a world and God, by God's will, decides all cats will live tortured, painful lives. And you cannot try to alleviate the pain of any cats. Like, that just seems crazy. But look, isn't divine will theory sort of committed to this as a possibility, at least? Because there's no constraints. It's just God's will that does all the work. So it's not like this hybrid view where you've got God's will plus the guarantee that whatever God chooses or whatever God wills is perfectly rational, because God's perfectly rational. Or whatever God chooses has got to be consistent with perfect goodness, or something like that, right? Because it's not a hybrid view. So we can only appeal to God's will to explain stuff. And in that case, it seems like God could technically have willed that it be obligatory to torture cats for eternity, and that seems pretty bad. Whatever morality is, it can't look like that. So it starts to look like a less plausible explanation of moral obligations.
And at least, so I interviewed Dr. Matthew Flanagan on divine command theory, and we go through, I think, like at least 10 objections to divine command theory. The two we've listed are some of them. He makes the move toward this kind of what you're calling the hybrid view. So I would assume most proponents, I could be wrong about this, I would think most proponents of divine command theory, like John Hare,
Yes.
Maybe Stephen Evans,
Yes.
And a few others would go toward this kind of hybrid approach where you have the limitation of whatever's good, like within all the things that are good, God can select some from those and make them obligatory, but he can't go outside the domain of what's good and pick something like torturing cats or something and make it obligatory.
Exactly right. So you make sure that whatever arbitrariness remains is not the sort of arbitrariness that would make us be like, that's not moral obligation, because it would mean you'd have to torture cats, right? So some feature of God, like God's perfect goodness or perfect rationality, can sort of constrain what God would command.
Do you want to say anything here about anything more about the hybrid view, or we've already kind of mentioned a few things? So
yeah, I think so. Something I discuss in the book is Robert Adams' sort of view, and he actually does something pretty interesting in that he takes God's will to explain a lot about moral obligations, but God's nature to explain things like moral goodness. So that's another way a view could be hybrid, but in a little bit of a different sense, and taking the different moral phenomena we might zero in on in the world and saying like something about what God wills or does, commands, explains one moral phenomenon, the obligation stuff, whereas something about God's nature explains like what's good, what's excellent.
Yeah, I have not read Finite and Infinite Goods, but it's on my list of books to read soon.
Cool.
All right. So there's one more objection here that we wanted to discuss, and that is the objection from secular contractualism.
Yeah, good. As long as you have mentioned Stephen Evans, I was going to say he has a recent paper that's responding to this sort of issue. So I would say to viewers, if you want to learn more, definitely check out the recent paper. So the objection is something like, actually, we can get a theory of obligation that has all the right features up and running just by appealing to what we owe to each other. For viewers that watch The Good Place, you probably have heard this tagline, what we owe to each other. And this is T.M. Scanlon's book that Chidi is trying to teach Eleanor Shellstrap throughout the course of the show. And it's giving a contractualist theory of moral obligation. And the idea behind contractualism is something like morality consists in what we owe to each other on account of all being equal, reasonable beings. So when I think about what I ought to do, I have to be constrained by thinking about like, what would other people like me, reasonable people who have equal standing, what would they reject? What sorts of principles might I act on that they would reject? If they would reject that, then it doesn't seem like I have the standing to do that. So these theories like Stephen Darwall's, which is the one that Evans is responding to in the recent paper, or Scanlon's, have been pretty powerful, and they seem like they explain all of the features that, for instance, Adams in Finite and Infinite Goods says belong to moral obligations. So if that's right, then it looks like a data-driven argument is not especially strong if it's supposed to secure the idea that God, in the second premise, right, God is the only available explanation. or even the best explanation if you're really compelled by the contractualist view.
And there will be more discussion on contractualism when we get to that next interview, right? That will come up some then. Okay.
About Scanlon.
So just a little plug to get your interest. If you're like, I want to know more about this kind of view, we'll definitely discuss it more in the next interview. So, okay, just to kind of recap what we just discussed, we said there's these two types of arguments that you can offer for God, for a particular metaphysical thesis about God's relationship to morality. There's data-driven arguments and there's explainer-driven. We focused on one type of data-driven argument. It's not the only type you discuss in the book. You discuss two others. And we presented that data-driven argument and then raised 3 objections to a premise in it. So I'm just trying to whet people's appetite and give them a sense of what's going on. Now I want to shift the focus over to explainer-driven arguments. And a proponent of an explainer-driven argument is Mark Murphy. So what is Mark Murphy's argument?
Yeah, good. So Murphy is focusing on the phenomenon of moral laws. And moral laws are supposed to be like these relationships that necessitate other stuff morally. So the idea is something like, here's a fact, like it's very painful for a cat when it gets tortured. And that fact necessitates that one ought not torture cats. The relationship that obtains between that ought not and the pain of torturing cats, that's like a moral law, is the idea. These like necessitation relations, if there is one. And so Murphy is interested in explanations for these types of things. And Murphy also thinks that by reflecting on the God of traditional theism, we can know that it's part of God's essence that whatever exists, God is the source of that thing and is in immediate control of that thing. So God has a sort of sovereignty over the world, God as creator, and God immediately sustains, controls everything that exists, and has to be the source of everything that exists. So once you believe that God exists, and you assume that if God exists, God has these features, the kind of sovereignty that he's talked about, then you have to think that God explains moral laws, these like necessitation relations between certain facts, and then the oughts that follow.
So I meant to put Murphy's argument up here. So I'll put it up and read it out, and we'll say a few more things about it. So the first step in the argument is moral laws obtain, and that's what you were describing when you say, there's this necessary connection between this ought, or I ought not do that, and this pain. There's this connection between them, and that would be like a kind of moral law there. And then step 2 says it's part of God's essence that if God exists, God necessarily grounds the moral laws by being their source, and he's in immediate control of them. And then step 3 in the argument is that God exists, and so it follows that God necessarily grounds moral laws. Now, what stands out to me is this is not an argument, and it's not intended to be, but it's not an argument for God's existence.
Right.
God's
existence, right? Yeah.
God's existence is one of the steps in the argument. What the argument's trying to show is that God grounds these moral laws.
Exactly.
So that's an interesting result, and I hope people will be more interested in checking out Mark Murphy's work there. Yeah. So did you want to say anything else about Murphy's argument here before we move on? Maybe some objections to it?
Yeah, I'll briefly mention I had a paper come out last week, I think, or the week before, that's a little bit more about this kind of explainer-driven argument and different kinds of theism and moral explanation. And there have been a lot of arguments in metaethics about moral realism and explanations for moral realism, like the idea that there really are moral laws, or there really are moral facts, and so on. And the thing that I argue in that paper, Varieties of Theism and Moral Explanation, and that comes up a little bit in the book, is that, as with many of these arguments, as I'm trying to show throughout the book, you've got to have a pretty specific conception of what God is like to make the argument go through. So for instance, in the divine will arguments that we just looked at, you got to think God has a will. Turns out you have to think that God has a will that differentiates between what God actually does and what God wants or wills. Otherwise, moral obligations couldn't be violated. So there are kind of specific commitments about what God is like as an agent here that are playing a role. And in Murphy's argument, the thing that I think is important to notice is that the view of God's sovereignty that plays a major role is not one that's shared by everyone. So there are, for instance, versions of Islam natural law theory, like hard natural law theories that say God creates the world, but God creates humans with a kind of reason that allows humans to figure out what will benefit others. And it's human reason figuring out what will benefit people and what will harm them that actually makes it obligatory for you to do the things that are beneficial and not do the things that are harmful. Yes, God created you and you have reason, but that kind of necessitation relation owes to something about humans and human reason and is not immediately explained by God. So that's sort of interesting because you might think that Islam is a variety of traditional theism. And so you might think this argument should work for every variety of traditional theism. But here we have a version of Islam where the argument isn't going to work. So not to object to the argument, but just to show that whether it works well or not depends on what you believe about God's relationship to creation and the created beings that he endows with reason, for instance.
I should have mentioned near the beginning when we offered a kind of overview of the book, and you may have used these terms when you were describing it, and I forgot. Do you want to use those labels now?
Yeah, so in the book, I create a sort of set of terms of art just for ease. And I talk about thin theism versus thick theism. And thin theism is something like, I sometimes call it bare bones theism. It's the idea that God is whatever being there is that's omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent. That's a classic way of spelling it out. Or God is the God of the Abrahamic traditions. And the assumption is something like all the stuff about exactly how God creates humans or how much authority God gives humans or whether God's in time or outside of time. All that stuff is sort of like put to the side in thin theism. Thick theisms are instead what you might think of as like creedal theisms or conciliar theisms, where the variety of theism in question is actually bound by all of these, for instance, councils that have said things about God was incarnate. When God was incarnate, this was the relation that human nature had to the divine nature. That's like a whole bunch of stuff that is going to further constrain what you say about God and moral laws and moral obligation and so on and so forth. So thick theisms are the sorts of theisms that I think we usually encounter in day-to-day life with people, the lived religions and people who have beliefs because of those lived religions.
Yeah, I'm really glad we laid that out. So
thank you, Jordan.
So to recap now where we're at, we've reached basically the halfway point. So the first part of the book was over God's relationship to normativity, moral norms. And now we want to shift to moral epistemology. So this will be a different type of argument than the ones we just described. So what is moral epistemology first?
Yeah, great question. It's the philosopher's term for questions about knowledge and beliefs. So moral epistemology can treat things like, how do we get our moral beliefs? They seem to a lot of people to be pretty different from like perceptual beliefs. Like if I'm looking at my wall and I think my wall is white, the tree outside is green, that feels pretty different than if I look outside and I'm like, oh my gosh, my neighbor just like was really rude to her spouse or something. That seemed wrong. That belief, whatever is going on to form that, seems like it happened through a different sort of mechanism than my perceptual belief. So moral epistemologists want to know, like, what was going on there? Other questions we ask in moral epistemology are things like, if we do have moral knowledge, like there's a moral obligation against killing innocents, how did we get it? Were we sort of created with it? Did we evolve so that we were tracking that sort of truth? What's the explanation there for how we could get moral knowledge if we are right in our moral beliefs? And then there are questions too about the justification for our beliefs. Like, why is it rational or okay to hold certain beliefs about the wrongness of killing innocents, for instance? Do we have any grounds for believing that? In certain instances, we might think we have pretty good grounds for believing that the tree outside has green leaves, for instance. We might think we have pretty good reasons to believe that the earth is round, has a moon, and so on, because we can do a certain sort of scientific experiment to figure that stuff out. But we can't really do scientific experiments to validate our moral beliefs, or so the thought often goes. Although I do talk about responses to that in that paper that came out a week or so ago. So how do we justify our beliefs if we can't just like use the scientific method or something? So that's all part of moral epistemology.
Excellent. Okay, now, you mentioned in the book that some philosophers have argued that theism actually leads to a kind of moral skepticism. It makes us skeptical of what we take to be objectively binding duties that we have, or even what's valued. And they do this by appeal to what some theists adopt, a particular view called skeptical theism. So what is skeptical theism?
Yeah, great. So there are a lot of skeptical theisms out there, and I home in on some classic formulations. And on these views, the views are created to respond to something we call the evidential problem of evil. And so the evidential problem of evil, just to summarize it, is that it looks like there's a lot of evil in the world. The sort of evil that a perfectly good being that's all powerful and all knowing just like wouldn't create a world where that was going to happen. And so that's pretty good evidence against the existence of such a being. So the argument goes. So how do we respond to this argument? There are lots of strategies, but one is the skeptical theist response. And that's to say, the evils that we think we see, we shouldn't be so sure that they're the sorts of things that a perfectly good, perfectly loving being that's omnipotent and omniscient wouldn't allow. Because actually, from our perspective, we're pretty limited in our perspective. So while it might look to us like the pain of that cat is obviously a reason against a divine being allowing that to happen, or creating a world where that's going to happen, we don't know what the balance of reasons looks like, ultimately. We don't know if there's something about the pain of that cat that gets outweighed by some other good that's going to result from it. We don't know what eventually will happen to that cat on account of its having pain, if it's going to be somehow redeemed in a very important way. So the strategy in general is to ask us to be a little bit skeptical about our own initial beliefs about evil. So we want to say, like, of course, the fawn dying in a forest fire is horrendously evil. It's needlessly evil, we want to say. And the skeptical theist move asks us to walk back that moral judgment a little bit, or the belief, and to say, actually, given how limited and finite we are, it's possible that we don't know just how bad that was. It might be less bad than it looks to us. God might have very good reasons for allowing that, that we're just not aware of. So in that way, it can respond to this inference that God probably doesn't exist, or a perfectly loving God probably doesn't exist because of this thing that looks like evidence. Turns out that thing is not such good evidence once we're skeptical about our own ability to track facts about how bad or good something is on the whole or on balance.
Just to give one more example in addition to that, I think, cat example, I did an interview with Justin McBrayer on skeptical theism, and he gave this example. You're walking one day and you see a child drowning in a swimming pool, and you're about to run and save the child, and your friend stops you because he's a skeptical theist and says, hey, wait a minute. You just don't know what God's reasons may be. Maybe God has an excellent reason to let that child drown. Maybe that child's going to grow up and be the next Hitler. So you better not intervene here. And we want to be like, no, we save the child. So that's just another example.
So that example by itself nicely illustrates an objection to this sort of view, right? Which is to say, but we certainly shouldn't act like this. Certainly we should act on the basis of these pretty commonsensical moral beliefs. And so some skeptical theists want to say, yeah, you can act like your beliefs are true in these cases, but just know that ultimately you might be wrong. But it's actually pretty hard to reconcile these things in my mind. What you ultimately believe about how reliable your moral judgments are, and then what you're doing on the basis of those moral judgments. I think most of us kind of want those things to cohere neatly. So, and we've spoken to this a little, but you can elaborate if you'd like. Does skeptical theism, at least in your mind, commit the theist to wide-ranging moral skepticism? Yeah. Since the book, I will say I've had more discussions with some skeptical theists. And I do think there are interesting ways that they can keep from having this wide-ranging moral skepticism. In particular, if you think that God's reasons for allowing certain harms are just in a different category than human reasons, that's a sort of new thing that I've been thinking about recently, due to some conversations with folks. So you might think that whatever we say about God's reasons and our not knowing God's reasons, we can't just transfer that easily to what we say about our reasons for doing or allowing certain harms. So I think that's a nice way to respond to objections like the one that Justin is bringing up with something you should intervene to prevent, it seems like. It says that you don't have to be skeptical about your reasons or what you ought to do. We can be pretty sure about the moral reasons that apply to humans. It's just that we don't know what sorts of reasons would apply to an omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving being that's in a category of their own.
Okay, so you already offered a kind of how to respond to the too much skepticism worry. I think Justin did give a response like that, and because he is a skeptical theist.
Right.
And I think he also, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, I think he also said that some skeptical theists appeal to divine revelation. If you have revelation that basically tells you what you should do, then that's what you're to do at that point.
Exactly right. So I think this is great. This is something I do bring up in the book. I think that I maybe reference Mike Ray's work on this, but I think this is great news for the overall line of the book, which is like, dig into particular theisms and see what they believe and like use their scriptures, So I think that here's a case where it's pretty important to pay attention to a tradition's scriptures, because it might turn out that while a scripture says God's ways are higher than your ways, it doesn't say anything about not being sure of what's required of you. And maybe it says a lot about like God has revealed to us by planting in our hearts such and such, right? And then you have pretty good reason to be certain of whatever it is that feels like an internal gut reaction to something, or your moral compass, if your scripture says like God implants that in human beings.
Now, we're going to shift from these kind of skeptical theist worries. Again, the point here was some philosophers want to say theism, it doesn't actually help your moral epistemology. It makes you a skeptic. You don't know if things are really right or wrong anymore. And the route to go there is through this kind of skeptical theist route. But now we want to shift and look at evolutionary debunking arguments, EDAs. So what is an EDA and what role is it playing in this discussion?
Yeah, good. So these have been made popular starting in the 2000s in the philosophical literature, primarily with respect to moral beliefs, but now they're being used for general, even our perceptual beliefs, and some folks are interested in how they apply there. So the idea is something like, we know a lot more about evolutionary biology than we ever have. And now that we know about sort of how humans have evolved and the sorts of pressures and drift that has made us into the sorts of critters we are and has formed our cognitive systems, there's really no good reason to think that our cognitive systems would have evolved to sort of track the moral truth. It looks like, in fact, most pressures are going to select for things like optimal survival of the species. And it's just not clear that being a very morally upright person is contributing to optimal survival. Now, there are folks who say it coincides nicely. But in general, the evolutionary debunking argument puts pressure on the idea that our moral beliefs are reliable. If our cognitive faculties are just the product of evolutionary pressures and drift.
Okay, so secular replies have been offered in the literature, but you, if I'm understanding you correctly from the book, you lay out some failures of these secular replies. So sketch those for us.
Yeah, good. So one of the secular replies in the moral beliefs section of this literature is something like, well, by happy coincidence, it turns out that the very things that nature was selecting for all along lead us to have beliefs that are also truth tracking. And it's not that nature selected for truth tracking beliefs, but there's some third factor that explains why the cognitive belief forming mechanisms we have with respect to moral beliefs turn out to be both truth tracking and selected for. Now, there's a lot of pushback to these, what are called third factor replies, in part because the coincidence seems pretty unsatisfactory to lots of people. Like, why should we believe that there's this third factor that just happily explains both? How are we so lucky to end up in a world where evolution selected the thing with that third factor? Or you might just not buy that the third factor really connects what evolution selects for and the right conception of morality. So you might be like, oh, well, evolution seems to select for the things that benefit the species, but morality is not, utilitarianism is not the correct theory of morality. So it's not actually about like maximizing benefits to the species being moral. It's about something like acting according to principles that know other rational being would have reason to object to. And then it's really hard to see how those things could coincidentally line up.
Gotcha. I think Shannon Street, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
She gives this good analogy of like a boat that's just adrift, and it just through chance alone just ends up in the right place.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that just seems unsatisfactory in terms of an explanation.
It's an the more lucky it is, the more coincidental, the more it feels like an unsatisfactory explanation.
So this is where theism can enter the picture. Does theism provide a satisfactory answer to evolutionary debunking arguments?
I think there's a lot of really excellent work there out there on theistic responses to evolutionary debunking arguments. Pretty impressive stuff. I know that you have said that you've had Andrew Moon on. I don't know if he's talked about.
I have a whole playlist of videos on God and morality, and Thomas Bogardus was the one that did the interview on this point.
Yeah, good. So, and I cite him in the book. So there are theists who have tried to respond to both the general epistemological worries that come out of evolutionary debunking arguments. So why should we think any of our belief-forming mechanisms are any good? And theists respond, like Thomas Bogardus, responding to the moral belief-forming mechanism problem. So something that a theist seems like they could say is like, God creates humans with a specific purpose, and the belief-forming mechanisms with which he creates humans, they are actually meant to track the truth. Or God has a design plan for humans. It includes a series of evolutionary shifts, but God's plan is that those shifts would produce just this sort of cognitive mechanism that we need to be able to apprehend important moral truths. So there's an explanation there that's not appealing to coincidence. There's a reason. It's not just lucky that evolution ends up producing this sort of cognitive faculty that we have that's in fact reliable, or that we've had it from the get-go.
So you end this chapter by discussing a potential kind of epistemic challenge for grounding morality in theism. And you call this Harman's challenge. So what is Harman's challenge?
Yeah, good. So I discussed this a lot more in that paper that just came out, because I found it interesting to think about for the purposes of the book, but didn't feel like I could, give it a complete treatment. Okay. So Harman is really, this is Gil Harman, is interested in how we can explain our kind of truth tracking moral belief faculties. And he's got really interesting ideas. He and several other of what folks following him have some interesting ideas about how we might respond to this challenge without appealing to God. So Harman wants to know how exactly we're going to say that, for instance, our beliefs about the wrongness of torturing cats are reliable, or our beliefs about justice could be true. And in the article that I just published, what I'm really interested in is responses to Harman's challenge that are completely secular, the kind of Cornell realist responses, that are saying something like, there are societal pressures that push us to care about the very things that justice is oriented towards. And so there are completely natural explanations that appeal to these features of what societies tend towards that could explain how we get the beliefs about justice that we get. for instance. So I think, anyway, so this is, again, discussed in the paper where I was trying to like explore explanationism a little bit more as a response to Harman's challenge. But yeah, I guess since 2019, I've thought about it a lot more and do find the secular arguments a little more impressive, I think, than I once did.
Do you? Well, okay, we just hit the hour mark, so I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, unless you want to say anything else.
I think that's good. Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much, Jordan. It's been fun.
All right, so we're going to go to the viewers' questions now. So go ahead and type your questions in the live chat. And as you're doing that, I would like to say, if you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a like. If you've watched a few of my videos and you're enjoying the channel, then subscribe. And if you really value the work that I'm doing here at the Analytic Christian, please consider becoming a patron. You can do that by going to the link in the description of this video. There you'll see that it takes you over to Patreon, and you can sign up to support me at any amount you want each month. And I appreciate all of my patrons. So let's go ahead and jump into the questions here. So Justin Mooney asked, what is the title of the paper Dr. Jeffrey mentioned a few times that was published a week or two ago, and what journal is it in?
Hi, Justin. I think we met in the fall. It's nice to see your name pop up. This one is called Varieties of Theism and Moral Explanations, and it's in the European Journal of Philosophy of Religion that just came out. But feel free to email me if you can't find it, if your institution doesn't subscribe to the journal.
All right. So Zach Raymer, who I believe, I can't remember if he is currently getting his PhD or he already has it, but he did it under Class Cray.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And I think he did it on skeptical theism, if I'm not mistaken. So perhaps he's done his dissertation. But anyway, he says, does skeptical theism also range over revelation? God might have some great reasons to permit us to be mistaken about revelation.
Yeah, I think this is a great question that leads us into something that I never discussed in the book, but I think is really important to these issues, which is divine hiddenness. So the idea that God chooses to be, in some sense, hidden to people, to not reveal God's self. Some folks, like Schellenberg, have said that the fact that there are many non-resistant non-believers, people who don't want to resist believing in God, but just can't find any evidence, God is hidden to them, that this fact shows that there's no perfectly loving, omnipotent, omniscient God. And my colleague here, Dr. Charity Anderson, is working on a project that is trying to shift that debate to talk about a sort of evidential problem of hiddenness, which I find pretty compelling. So asking questions like what sort of evidence is hiddenness against God's existence? And you might worry that skeptical theism pushes us to think that God has very good reasons to be hidden. Maybe you don't worry about that. Maybe you think this is a great response to the problem of hiddenness, if you thought that was a pretty good evidence against God's existence. But it also leaves us with more skepticism. Maybe God remains hidden, or it's very confusing. There are conflicting scriptures. There are conflicting interpretations of scriptures. Why does God leave us in the dark about how to interpret these scriptures that seem so important for how we ought to live? That might really bother you. So on the one hand, you could use skeptical theism to respond to these kinds of problems of hiddenness. On the other hand, you might think this might lead to a sort of despair when the skeptical theists' best response to the too much skepticism worry was like, look to Revelation.
I would like to say thank you to a YouTuber named Thank You Jesus. He gave a super chat of $5, so I really appreciate the support. Thank you, Jesus. All right. My Facebook friend. I've never actually gotten to interact with Ben Watkins, but he runs a podcast called Real Atheology, and basically he brings on all the expert atheist philosophers, and they have really good, high quality discussions. So go check out Real Atheology. Ben asked, I'd love to know what Dr. Jeffrey thinks about atheistic conceptions of objective morality, such as those put forward by Willenberg, Oppie, and other naturalist philosophers.
Yeah, that's great. My honest opinion is I find it impressive. This is probably why you can see me leaning towards the explainer-driven arguments, because I just think, as a theist who has tremendous respect for the majority of people in my area of philosophy and metaethics, most of whom are doing the whole thing without appealing to God at all. And I find myself willing to buy a lot of what they say and asking, like, why do we need God in the picture? I like the explainer-driven argument because it says, like, so long as you've already committed to God's existence, you've got to think God explains this in some way, this moral phenomenon. But I will say, like, I think that there's a lot to be said for how the reason that God has given us allows us to come up with, like, very good explanations for morality. I think it's sort of interesting that here's a perspective you might take. You might think it's actually more evidence that God is good and gracious, that God provides us with the sorts of cognitive faculties that can come up with naturalistic arguments for real objective morality, because objective moral obligations, for instance, are so important for us to believe in as humanity, that it's better for all of us if more people believe in it. And if belief in certain varieties of theism is waning, all the better that these arguments are available. So Willenberg is actually someone who's one of the first to give the third factor response we were talking about earlier. But yeah, I think it's impressive stuff and important. And another way you might think about these views, if you are a theist even, and you do buy the explainer-driven type of arguments, is that it's nice to have a sort of backup theory, that your moral beliefs are not so precarious as to be like this exact kind, like a God with this exact kind of sovereignty has got to exist. Otherwise, I don't believe that there are objective moral obligations. It's great to say, like, I think probably this is true. But even if God didn't exist, I think I still shouldn't kill innocent people. And it doesn't depend on what I care about or am committed to, that's true. I think that's great.
All right. This will be the last question from Justin Mooney. He said, regarding evolutionary debunking arguments, suppose we evolved a way to cognitively access a priori. I never know how to, can you tell me how to say that? I only read it. And I'm
living in a Roman world. I don't think that any of us know.
A priori truths about, because basic reasoning is adaptive and moral knowledge is an accidental byproduct of this. Thoughts?
Okay. So just to maybe put this into different words, I know that Justin's a philosopher, but for the viewers who maybe are not familiar with the notion of an a priori truth, here the idea is something like, it's a truth that you don't need like experience to go, something to go out and test to know that it's true. So you might know, for instance, a priori that, someone like Kant thinks a priori that certain forms of lying are going to be wrong. And you can know that because you can just sit in your armchair and think about a world where people do not communicate honestly with one another. And you can realize that the world would very quickly break down. And so you can know that this is not the sort of thing that all rational beings would accept, or like that they could all will at the same time. Wouldn't work. Okay, so suppose we evolve a way to access these sorts of truths. So like we get Kant's version of our rational faculty, like pure practical reason, because it's super adaptive for some reason. And then it turns out some a priori moral truth, or some a priori truths are moral truths. That's awesome. And it's not like evolution was pushing us towards true, moral truths at all. It was just pushing us towards a faculty that's super adaptive, and something that's really adaptive is knowing things that you don't come to know by experience. I guess my worry about this is like whether we could tell a plausible story about a priori truths being adaptive. I'm having, if you think that there are certain mathematical truths that are a priori that help us in like hunter-gatherer societies, maybe it is really important to know that 2 and 2 is 4, and to be able to know that without experience. So maybe that's a case where an a priori truth is or an ability to get an a priori truth is adaptive. And then if moral truths can be reasoned to using the same faculty, then you can get moral knowledge. That'd be interesting. But it's got to be not just 2 + 2 = 4. It's got to be like a lot of a priori truths, I think, right, for it to evolve. So lots of these have to be adaptive. And I'm thinking usually adaptive truths are adaptive because they're the sorts of things one would have experience of getting wrong and then correct for. So they would be a posteriori truths. So that would just be my one question about that. But I'll think about it. Thanks, Justin.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey, for joining me.
Thank you, Jordan. This is really fun. And I appreciate you inviting me to be on the channel.
So we've not yet figured out the date for the next interview, but there is going to be a part 2 where we talk about arguments from moral motivation, God's relationship to moral motivation. So be on the lookout for that. And if you're really interested in the topic of God and morality, just check out the playlist of videos I have on the topic. Like I mentioned, I interview several philosophers really on many of the points we hit on tonight. So check that out. One last reminder, next week, I have an interview with James, I think you say his name, Bilby, on this new book called Postmortem Opportunity, A Biblical and Theological Assessment of Salvation After Death. He argues for postmortem opportunity. I've read the book. It's really interesting. I'm looking forward to talking to him about that. Okay, I will end it there. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.